Howdy, Tommy from Tanknicians here, and in this video we're going to be discussing the most important parameter to the health and success of your reef tank. And it might surprise you, it's not lighting, it's not water chemistry, it's flow. Flow is critical for coral health and coloration and growth in your aquarium, as well as the overall health of your aquarium. So we're going to discuss a little bit on why that is, and we're also going to discuss how to identify good flow in an aquarium. We're going to talk about the difference between low, medium, and high flow, because that's often a sticking point for people. And then I'm going to show you ways that you can evaluate the flow in your own aquarium. Flow is super critical to the success of your aquarium for two reasons. The first being that everything in your tank has what's known as a boundary layer. A boundary layer is this thin layer of water that sticks to the surfaces of everything in the tank. And what else is sticking to the surfaces of everything to your tank? Microbes, different bacteria, archaea, things like that. Also sponges, bryozoans, your corals themselves. They all have this boundary layer on top of them, this thin layer of water that has to get removed in order for them to do their biological functions effectively. So in the absence of adequate flow, that boundary layer doesn't get pulled off by the currents in your aquarium. And when that happens, that boundary layer can get saturated with nutrients or waste products that the corals and microbes are trying to get rid of. This can decrease their efficiency, and sometimes those pollutants can build up to a point where they actually become toxic to the animals in your aquarium. So as an example, corals produce, the algae inside of corals produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. And if it's peak day in your tank, your lights are on really high, you don't have a ton of flow though, that oxygen can build up to toxic levels inside of the coral, and this is something that can lead to bleaching in your aquarium. The second reason why flow is super important to the health of your aquarium is that it's moving stuff around. So if you have adequate flow, you won't allow stuff to settle anywhere in the aquarium. So bits of algae, uneaten food, fish poop, things like that, you want them to get moved around in the aquarium until they're able to go down the overflow into your filtration, where you can then remove them through husbandry. If you don't have proper flow, particles are going to settle in the aquarium and they're going to build up over time and they're going to turn into detritus. Now, a little bit of detritus isn't a bad thing. In fact, it's probably really good for the tank. But if you have too much detritus building up in a certain area over time, it's going to become anoxic, meaning that there's not going to be oxygen below the layers of detritus, and then you get different types of organisms breaking it down, and they can produce some pretty noxious byproducts. So anoxic detritus is something that you want to avoid. All right, so when you're calculating flow rate in your aquarium, you want to do that in terms of turnover. So turnover is the amount of time that it takes to move all of the water in your aquarium within an hour. So if you have 10x turnover, that means that if you have a 100-gallon aquarium, you're moving 1,000 gallons of water per hour. So you can calculate this by factoring in your return pump and also the power heads in your aquarium. Now, for low flow aquariums, we classify that anywhere between 30 and 50 times per hour turnover. And this is a lot higher than most people, but that's what we consider low flow, because when we see aquariums with lower flow than that, we notice that there ends up being excessive detritus buildup in the aquarium, either underneath the rocks or in the pockets of the sand, typically towards the back of the tank. Moderate flow we define as anywhere between 50 and 80x turnover. So this could be accomplished in a 100-gallon aquarium with two Nero 5s running mostly full power, and then your return pump. You could also accomplish this by having multiple power heads and you run them at slightly lower power levels, but it gives you more control over where that flow is going and when. High flow we consider anywhere between 80 times turnover and up. So in our coral troughs, and again that's designed differently from a typical reef tank, but we're right now pushing 150x turnover, and I would prefer a little more flow in our coral troughs than what we have now. A lot of people are afraid to provide proper flow in their aquariums because they think that the flow is going to hurt the corals. And keep in mind, coral reefs are very high energy environments. There's lots of wave action, and the water flow is often much higher than what we have in our aquariums, especially if it's a high current day or if the tide is low and these are corals that are up near the surface. they can be getting way more flow than what we're able to provide in a reef tank, and they do objectively better in those conditions. In my opinion, more flow is better, but of course you have to keep an eye on your corals and see how they're responding to it. Typically, if your tank has been low flow for a while, I don't recommend adding a bunch of powerheads and bringing it right up to that high flow state. You should add powerheads and increase the power on them slowly if they're controllable, or add just one or two at a time until you reach that optimal flow that you're shooting for. All right, so I want to give you a visual representation of what proper flow looks like. So we have a rock here. We can imagine this is part of our aquascape, and the water movement that you're looking for should be something like this, okay? So about that speed, all right? A couple inches a second is pretty good for corals. Now you don't want it blasting on something like a zoanthid or a mushroom coral. Like if you see the tissue is furling over on your mushrooms, or if your zoanthids are closing in response to the flow and they won't open up, then that's too much flow for them. But if you have diffuse flow, meaning that it's not a jet coming out of, say a return pump type pump, a maxi jet type pump, if you have a column of water that's moving and it's moving at about this speed, that's pretty ideal for your corals. Now, when we talk about optimizing flow, you don't just want a current of water moving. Corals don't live in rivers. You want water movement coming from all different directions at different times. So ideally, you would have flow coming in this direction, pushing the corals, and then you would have it come from the opposite direction, and then maybe sometimes they combine and create a little eddy type flow. You got the flow coming up, flow coming down. You want flow hitting these corals and your rocks in all different directions so that you can make sure that you're pushing any detritus up and out, and also that you're removing that boundary layer from all sides of the animals and bacteria in your aquarium. A good way to evaluate the flow that you have is to just get a little bit of flake food and drop a pinch of that in the tank right in front of a power head and see how it moves throughout the tank. And if you notice that this flake food is settling anywhere in the aquarium, that's an indication to you that you should be revisiting how your flow is moving throughout the tank, potentially adding another power head or changing the directions of the ones that you already have. As your tank matures and your corals grow, you're going to need to add more flow, or the flow will become a limiting factor in the health and growth of your corals. Here we have a really great example of what optimal flow looks like in an aquarium. So this coral isn't getting a ton of flow right now, but just wait. It's about to get blasted in one direction for a significant duration of time. This is removing the boundary layer fully, and you can see this coral is just getting whipped around right now, and the polyps are still wide open. It's a very happy coral. You saw how the flow moved, changed from a different direction. It's about to do the same thing right now. This is perfect. This leather is going to grow extremely quickly. It's going to be very resilient. It's going to have great coloration. It's going to be very healthy. This is ideally what you would like to provide throughout the entirety of your tank. And if you look at the particles in the water, see how randomly they're moving. They're not all traveling in one direction. This is what you want to see in a tank. So I'm going to be showing you some other clips soon of corals to demonstrate kind of low, medium, and high flow, and also how to tell what's good flow on less obvious corals. So here's an example of some pallies in what I would consider moderate flow. You can see that their tentacles are moving. The flow isn't sustained. It's kind of pushing on them and then giving them a break and then pushing on them again. Pallies and zoanthids, when they're in higher flow, they will inflate themselves to kind of give themselves more support, whereas if they're in very low flow, they won't do that. Here you can see a smaller zoanthid that also its polyps are moving, its tentacles are moving with the flow, but it's still wide open. These corals are going to grow extremely quickly in these conditions. Here we have a hammer coral that's also in moderate flow. Ideally, this coral would get some pulses with higher flow, but you can still see that it's pushing all around the coral, and its water is moving everywhere, and that's what they need to be healthy. So here's a clip of low flow, and these zoanthids are basically only being really moved by this hawkfish. And when the hawkfish is gone, you see these tentacles aren't really moving. The zoanthids are growing fine here, like it's not bad for them, but it's suboptimal, and you can get detritus building up in between them. It can help different nuisance pests live in those interstitial spaces. This I would consider a pretty decent example of high flow. This is also on a pally. These are your classic OG yellow polyps, but they can take being whipped around by some pretty decent flow. And again, we're not constantly hitting them with that really, really high flow. It pulses. So here we go. They're getting a ton of flow right now. They're getting whipped around and they're not retracting. They're not closing up. They're super happy. If you want to invest in some really high quality flow for your aquarium, there's really only two options that I would recommend. If you need diffuse flow, say you have a nano aquarium or you're putting the powerheads on the back of the tank and they're moving forward, they're going to hit that front glass in just a foot or two, then I'd recommend the Nero powerheads. They produce incredibly diffuse flow. They're unmatched as far as any powerhead that I've ever used in terms of creating that great, nice diffuse flow. If you need to move water in more of a jet form, say from one end of your tank to the other, you have a larger tank, 4 foot, 6 foot tank, then I'd recommend the Reef Octopus Octopulse powerheads. They're incredibly reliable, really well designed. They don't have quite as much controllability as the Neros, but for that application, you really don't require that. Great thing about the Neros is you can literally set them up so that they'll turn on full power or whatever your max intensity is for whatever period of time you choose. So oftentimes we'll set them up where they'll turn on to their max intensity for 15 to 30 seconds, and then we'll have them lower to a much slower intensity for the same period of time. This allows us to get that column of water moving across the tank, and then it'll pause. Another powerhead or flow pattern can, build up momentum and move water in the opposite direction before it turns on again. They're great powerheads for really dialing in your flow. If you're local, come on, by to the shop, bring us a video of the tank, preferably when you fed. We can give you some high quality advice. If you're not local, you can always send us a DM on Instagram. I'd be happy to help, send me a video of your tank with some flake food moving around it. I can give you some recommendations. We can even ship out these powerheads to you if you're interested. Thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. We got a lot of great content coming out in the future. We're going to be talking a lot more about quarantine and all things aquarium related. Also, if you have any specific questions about this video or anything else, feel free to leave it in the comments. I'd be happy to address those, and I'm sure that I've overlooked a bunch of stuff when it comes to flow. So, maybe if we get enough of those, that'll inform a future video where we can take an even deeper dive. But again, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.